He, him pronouns. My name is Michael. I'm PM for proposition side. My speech would start my first word. Reunification is unlikely to happen, very costly and counterproductive under side opposition's best case scenario. Proposition stands proudly to propose the motion for two argumentations under our side of the House. Firstly, on how reunification is unlikely to happen and is oftentimes very costly on a long-term basis. Secondly, as to why, even if you can attain reunification, the outcomes of reunification on the stigma between North Koreans and South Koreans are oftentimes very bad. But before going on to argumentations, three key pieces of framing in this debate. First key piece of framing. What is our stance? Our stance is to recognize them as an independent nation that's operating on their own independent basis. What is our counterfactual then? We want to maintain good relations with North Korea, even if it means that we're going to recognize them as an independent state. Those are two reasons as to why maintaining good relations is going to be a successful counterfactual. Firstly, North Korea would not be triggered by the fact that you have no reunification because they want to maintain their power of being an authoritarian state. Secondly, South Korea would have an active incentive to avoid triggering North Korea, who is a nuclear powerhouse in the status quo. But second piece of framing, how would the attempt to reunify look like under their side? I think there are two ways that they could approach this. Firstly, they could use systematic military campaigns to take down North Korea's regime and unify them as part of South Korea. Their second way is use diplomatic ways, which is funding in things like negotiations and diplomatic discussions. But no, these two ways are oftentimes very unlikely, which I'll prove in my first argument. But third, this is an actor motion. This house is South Korea. So this means that for this reunification, it has to be in favor of South Korea. It would have to be South Korea trying to maintain control in the process of reunification. It is unlikely that South Korea would concede to reunification during the process to North Korea during this entire process. But before going to my first argumentation, any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Seeing none, going on to my first argumentation as to why it is very unlikely that reunification would happen, and the process at which you try to reunify is oftentimes very impactfully harmful. Firstly, why is reunification very unlikely? We have 5 reasons for this. Firstly, there's oftentimes very strong levels of social stigma. People are against reunification within South Korea and will backlash against the government. Oftentimes, a large demographic within South Korea are proud with their fact that they're in a democratic state and a capitalistic state in South Korea. This looks like them actively hating on the authoritarian and propaganda happening in North Korea. They also inherently view them as people outside of South Korea. That is to say, there is no active incentive for people to want to support the cause of reunification. If they actively do not like the idea of outsiders being within their country, they would not want to reunify. What is the implication of this? Governments and politicians want to get reelected. If the people do not want to have reunification, the degree to which you can support reunification by politicians is very limited, even if they can have fiat to say that they want to support this. But secondly, you're just going to end up having a deadlock in diplomatic discussions, because to reunify means you need to have a unitary political structure. And South Korea is never going to accept authoritarianism from North Korea, and North Korea is never going to accept democracy from South Korea. It looks like you're actively trying to take down the structure of North Korea's propaganda and authoritarian state, but it is very unlikely they just walk up to Kim Jong-un and be like, can you turn into a democracy right now? And they'd be like, yeah, sure, and then you reunify. We think that's basically not going to happen. We think that this deadlock is going to happen in diplomatic discussions. But even if their side is going to use the second way to military weapons, the third reason as to why reunification is very unlikely is because you can never outcompete a nuclear powerhouse that North Korea has. It is unlikely that your attempts at reunification through military campaigns is going to be successful against a country of North Korea that literally has the most number of nuclear weapons in the world. But lastly, notice, the longer that you don't reunify, the less faith that people have on reunification, because you're spending taxpayers' money on something that people see is not happening or not having a tangible impact immediately. If there's oftentimes less support for reunification, the degree to which you support reunification is oftentimes very limited. But secondly, the second layer, why is reunification very costly? Notice, because even if side opposition is able to come up here to say that reunification is very successful, there's probably an effort that will go on in the long term, because we believe that this process to reunify, it is probably, this is very simple. Fund things like military campaigns and diplomats and weapons in order to achieve reunification, which all come from taxpayers' money. The comparative then and the impact is that you waste huge amounts of money and economic resources on a long-term process for 30 years that we told you is not going to yield any sort of results on the diplomatic stage. Notice, there's no moving on to my second argumentation. But before moving on, are there any POIs? 3, 2, 1. Seeing none, let me prove to you in my second argument as to why there's going to be very huge conflicts between South Koreans and North Koreans once you reunify. First layers. South Koreans and North Koreans are ideologically different politically, culturally, structurally, and economically. We tell you that political systems to even begin with are very different because South Korea is very hugely democratic and North Korea is very hugely authoritarian. There's different degrees of freedom that were given to the people. Notice, many North Koreans were taught and propagated that South Koreans have been co-opted by the West and are evil people. South Koreans were taught the North Koreans were not to be all to be respected or not or is viewed as an outsider because they're living in an authoritarian state, and authoritarian is viewed and demonized in South Korea. Notice, there's already a very strong level of pre-existing stigma against each other. What would happen then if you force reunification to happen? Notice, if you put reunification forces, even if you're able to attain this, you put them in the same cities, governments, and applying for the same jobs, etc. You actively force these people who have a bad perception of each other to coexist in the same community. It looks like you actively hate on the people, pre-North Korean people, because you just simply hate them, and you put them together, and then conflicts would automatically happen. What are the impacts of this? Simply, you infringe on the rights of North Koreans to get what they want within a same area where the majority of people are South Koreans who have better education, who have better economic job opportunities. The North Koreans are systematically kept out of because South Koreans are already have pre-existing stigma against these people to even begin with. Notice that these North Koreans are now part of South Korea or the Republic of Korea. And since this is an actor motion and you incorporate these citizens as part of your nation, you now count their impact. That is to say, the balance in the inequality of treatment of both sides of the people are now under South Korea. That is to say, the impact is going to be counted in an actor motion that you're South Korea. Now moving on to preemptions under their side of the house. We know that side opposition is going to come up here and claim that they're going to maintain good relations in this argument, in this debate. But we have two major responses to this. Firstly, we rather say that reunification is actually going to intensify the conflict between North Korea and South Korea. That argument is most likely going to be contradictory because notice that the attempt to reunify is most likely going to make this country a democratic country. So North Korea would view that as a threat to their propaganda, political agenda, or authoritarian status. You most likely escalate tensions trying to overtake North Korea because North Korea has an active incentive, like Kim Jong-un has an active incentive to protect the political structure that is the authoritarianism within their state, especially by using military weapons. But notice, our model literally recognizes North Korea as an authoritarian state, as an independent political structure. That is to say, they're independent, but it doesn't mean that we're not going to have good relations. It's most likely not going to spike conflicts on our side. For these reasons, I'm so proud to propose the motion. Thank you.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. I invite first speaker from side opposition.
Right, thank you, Chair. Can you please confirm if you can hear me if I speak like this?
Yes.
All right, thank you. May I have a few seconds to set up my timer and order my papers? All right, I'll be accepting POIs after the 4th minute, no preferred gender pronouns. If you do wish to raise a POI, I will not be looking at the chat box. You can simply unmute yourself. So I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. There are a couple of structural reasons as to why side proposition has already lost the debate from their first speaker. The first is that we think it's a strategic flaw for them to focus on why reunification on its own is something that becomes a bad idea without showing us structural reasons as to why the recognition of statehood should be the rhetoric that should exist within that society. But two, we think that the number of contentions that they make are something that hasn't been fully mechanized, and we're going to give you structural reasons why. First, they tell you that, you know what, people in South Korea don't care about North Koreans, and they've had this perception of North Koreans that actually demonizes the North Koreans, and then they're less likely going to care about them. We think this is untrue for two reasons. First, we think that these individuals generally have a shared culture that actually binds them to North Koreans, because we think the lines of the 38 parallel that divide the two countries are arbitrary lines. They're not lines that exist because of cultural differences or belief systems. But two, we think that the rhetoric that the West has given North Korea is not a rhetoric that demonizes people on the ground. We think it's a rhetoric that demonizes the regime. We think when they talk about how Kim is so evil, how Kim is doing some atrocities within that nation, we don't think this translates to say that people that live in North Korea are generally evil people. We think it's only the system of government that is actively being demonized. So we think that clash doesn't work within this debate. Lastly, we're going to integrate the rest of our rebuttals. I said fourth minute. So lastly, we're going to integrate the rest of our rebuttals within our speech. But before we get there, let's attend to this very, very disingenuous claim. Firstly, they tell us that, you know what, you're going to have a deadlock. We're going to give you mechanistic reasons as to why that deadlock is something that would still even value over the recognition of statehood. But two, we're going to show you how we generally are able to overcome that particular structural deadlock. So firstly, on setup, before we get to our arguments. One, we think the recognition of statehood does three things. First, we think that it endorses sovereignty upon North Korea. It legitimizes their form of government, and it legitimizes human rights abuses. What is this to say? This is to say, if you recognize a country as a state, that means you recognize them as a state that does just things to its people, that acts justly across the world. We think this is what this particularly looks like. But secondly, we think that the pursuit of this reunification doesn't look like just going to war with North Korea. We think, one, this actually looks like deconstructing the echo chamber that North Korea has created, making it hard for people within North Korea to pursue reform. What is this to say? We think that people within North Korea hate Kim Jong-un and they don't like Kim Jong-un, right? And we think that's the main reason why a lot of them flee from the country going to South Korea. So this is necessary because a pursuit of deconstructing that echo chamber to generate reform within the country is most likely to work, because we think that it's also going to face opposition internally. But two, we think that this pursuit looks like even harboring refugees that then expose the injustices of North Korea to the world. We think because they've remained isolated, that's why they haven't received so much international pressure that actually necessitates change within that country. This is to say that at a point in time in which we have nuclear powers all around the world, right, that actively push against dictatorship, we think even if Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons, they are still held back by the idea of mutually assured destruction, and this is something that will practically be a curtailing measure. But firstly, why do we think that the pursuit of reunification is something that suits this particular South Korean government? One, we think that the interests of the people are what guides the political will of said government. This is to say that the cultures that people subscribe to is what generally guides the liberal democracy that exists within South Korea. Why is this important? We think South Koreans have a Confucian ideology that values community and duty and values the intertwined belief systems that exist between them and their fellow North Korean brothers. This is to say that they don't recognize the arbitrary lines that divide them, but think that they still think that they are somewhat tied to the people that exist within the North, which brings us to our first argument on why we think that the South Korean government has a principal obligation to Korean identity. There are three reasons why we think that this obligation is true. One, we think that the Korean identity itself is built upon family and loyalty to your neighbors, right? This is to say, in pursuing unification, it means you are pursuing the freedom of your neighbor, and we think this is something that South Koreans value as a nation, and we think actively going to do that is actually representing your interest as a South Korean government. But two, we think that because of the past generations that have been intertwined through family lines, through cultural lines, is the main reason why South Korean people believe that they have an interest and a stake at North Korea and North Korean citizens. And this is particularly the reason why they want to tie to them. Why is this particularly important within this debate? Firstly, we think that recognition of statehood does three things. First, it means that you don't have an obligation to the people. And we think that at a point in time in which the will of the people culturally informs government, you actively go against your obligation to those particular people as a South Korean government. And this is something that you don't want to do. But two, it means that you don't intervene within the injustices that exist in the North. And we don't think this is something that South Koreans value because of their Confucian belief system that says you should have loyalty to your neighbor, that you should have something that
Before you move
you should
on,
have an incentive to protect your neighbor. We think this is something that the Korean society particularly values within that. So the impact of this is that we don't think states can willfully go against their obligation principally. And this is why we think that even if it doesn't succeed in pursuing, this principle is still valuable because government ought to follow their principal obligation to people. So this leads us to our second claim on why this creates buyout internally and externally and the implications of that. One, we think that there are three reasons why this is particularly true. First, we think that people buy into ideologies in line with liberal democracy within South Korea. This is important because one, at a point in which you do recognize statehood, that means you legitimize dictatorship, and we think people within a liberal democracy don't actively subscribe to that. Why is this true? We think because the liberal democracy generally exists, it means that the
before
people that
protected
exist
time,
within said society value those principles of liberalism. But two, what this means is that the West also cuts ties with South Korea. And this is particularly problematic for two reasons. One, we think that the West has an obligation to its principles of fostering liberal democracy. So what this means is that it will cut all economic ties with South Korea. It will cut all international relations with South Korea. We think this is going to be very impactful on one, the economy of South Korea, which will generate discontent from people when the socio-economic conditions start to worsen. But two, we think on the South Korean government itself, you get buyout because people think you're also following the same lines of dictatorship that Kim Jong-un that is Kim Jong-un is pursuing. Because if you actively legitimize their leadership, that means you consider it to be a viable form of leadership. And it means that as a South Korean government, you're less likely to target that voter demographic because it means that you're most likely going to follow through with that. But thirdly, we think that this makes South Korea more vulnerable to annexation. There are three reasons why this is true. First, we think that if you recognize statehood, you endorse legitimacy, breaking your ties with the West. But two, what it means is that you then give Kim an upper hand to invade you because there is no mutually assured distraction between the Western powers that support you and Kim Jong-un who wants to invade you. So the importance of this nuance was that maintaining ties with the West creates a sense of mutually assured distraction, and actively going against the principles of liberal democracies will cut these ties. And in the end, we think that you are most likely to get an invasion from Kim Jong-un from the North. With this, we have never been more proud to oppose.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. I invite GPM.
Okay. Am I both visible and audible right now?
Yes.
Okay. I go by she, her pronouns, and I prefer verbal PIs. If no one interrupts in the next 5 seconds, I'm going to start. So the primary arguments on the opposition rely on this false assumption of the true interests of South Koreans and South Korean governments, right? So first, I'm going to get into the main points of contention in this debate, and then I'm going to go on to some case extensions. So first, the opposition tries to tell you that South Koreans somehow owe North Koreans and want to help North Koreans because they share a culture and they have a shared identity, right? But we argue that in the past 80 years where they've been separate, these two countries have diverged into very opposite paths, right? North Korea has become increasingly authoritarian, and South Korea is now recognized as an international democratic country, right? We argue, like Michael has told you, that there's been such a shift in mindset that they no longer recognize each other as equals, and they actually recognize each other as more so enemies because of what has been fed to them by their governments, right? And testimonies from North Korean defectors who have now been living in South Korea also mentioned like the discrimination that they faced because they were from South Korea. They were seen as brainwashed and less educated, and therefore less deserving of like certain jobs. We'll get into more of that later. And next, they also talk about how it's in the shared interest of South Koreans to pursue unification, and the government should respect that, right? So first, this is just inherently false, right? Because now, as South Koreans and North Koreans have begun spending more and more time apart, that this idea of a shared identity has become less and less strong, right? Because in fact, we tell you now that young Koreans, up to 70% of them, actually do not want reunification anymore. So next, they also tell you that because of this Confucian ideology that South Koreans subscribe under, that they feel an obligation to protect their fellow Koreans. So one, they're so first, cross apply like all the things I mentioned above, where they don't view each other as the same kind of Korean anymore. And secondly, this is not exactly how Confucianism works, right? Because Confucianism essentially works on a system of obedience and respect, right? Education and scholarship is what's most important in Confucianism. They argue that a gentleman should be highly educated, and therefore that's why you should respect them. So because South Koreans and North Koreans don't share the same ideology, they don't have the same background, the same education, we argue that this actually turns their argument, right? Because instead, this Confucian ideology would be twisted to flip it to make it so that North Koreans should be obedient to South Koreans, that they somehow owe South Korea for saving them from like years of an authoritarian regime, right? So next, they also talk about how by separating North Korea and South Korea officially, this would legitimize like North Korean human rights abuses, right? First, this is just inherently not true, because statehood doesn't mean, by recognizing someone as a state, doesn't mean we're recognizing that they're a good country, right? We recognize many countries that also conduct human rights atrocities, just like, for example, like the Congo genocide. Yet we still recognize Congo as a country. And we argue that by recognizing North Korea as a country, actually it makes it easier for other countries to intervene in their human rights abuses, right? Because currently these abuses can be seen as a domestic issue, right? An issue for South Korea to figure out by their own, because it's an issue between the country. However, by separating these states, you create a clear delineation, right? Which country is doing good in the human rights realm and which is not. So you actually allow for more countries to step in, and you give them more like legitimization and make it easier for countries to step in to actually help out with these human rights abuses. So next, they also talk about how they also mentioned like a principal obligation to help their neighbors. One, it is still possible for South Korea to step in and help North Koreans, right? Because they're still next to each other. There's still an incentive for South Korea to help. One, it would still strengthen their international image. And next, we argue that it is actually more likely for South Korea to be able to help North Korea if they were to separate into two official countries, right? Because right now North Korea is very on the defensive, right? In a little bit, because South Korea actively is pursuing reunification, so they're on the defensive. They have to protect their own interests. But if you make it clear that you're two different nations, they're more willing to make these smaller concessions. Before I get on to my extensions, I'll take a POI.
So if you do recognize statehood, why is there still an incentive for you to reunify Korea when you do recognize them as a state?
I don't really understand this question. We don't want to reunify. We're saying that there's still an incentive for them to protect human rights in North Korea, because one, I believe, because one, it's still important for their international relations to do so. And secondly, if, like you said, they do care about North Koreans, it's not because they're part of the same country, right? It's because they feel an inherent need to protect these people. So next, another layer of reasoning about why reunification is bad, right? Because South Korea simply does not have the capacity to absorb North Korea in the status quo, because North Korea's economy is extremely bad, right? They're highly reliant on allies like China for food and other resources. This means that reunification means that China will most likely pull out because they oppose South Korea and the US. Reunification is a threat to them because a Western ally would be essentially on their border, right? South Korea already has an intense competition for jobs. Having a decent quality of life is already extremely expensive. So when you add another like 25 million people into the equation, there's no way that the current economy and the system of governance can support this, especially because most North Koreans are not trained in South Korean jobs, which are typically like office jobs that require higher education and access to better technology. In South Korea, this is just not, most North Koreans right now not have access to this type of technology on a day-to-day basis. And also because so this means that North Korean people likely wouldn't be able to support themselves in the South Korean economy, in the South Korean system right now. This means that they would need a lot of support from the government, right? The government would need to step in with additional social assistance, social welfare programs to help them. This would include things like housing, food stamps, etc. These are all extremely costly, right? Especially when half your population is like this, when half your population is essentially unable to find jobs. So this would likely spend like trillions of money, right? And this would explode taxes and just debts that the country has in order to try to sustain half the population. And this creates a perpetuating cycle of discrimination like Michael was discussing, right? Because now South Koreans have even more reason to look down on North Koreans because they're like, oh my God, they're like such a burden to our economy. We have to do so much to support them. And it just creates a more harmful narrative of North Koreans, right? And also and next layer is just the direct impact of reunification is also devastating, right? Because like Michael said, it's highly unlikely that this will be achieved through diplomatic ties because North Korea has explicitly said that they're not interested in reunification. And so this would likely lead out to an all-out war, wrecking infrastructure support systems. You just lose out on tens of thousands of lives that just did not need to be lost in the first place and are not worth it because of the harms that we already mentioned, right? So for all these reasons, we're proud to propose. Thank you.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. I invite Diallo.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to know if I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, so let me just set my internal timer and then we'll begin shortly. My external timer, sorry. Right, I'll be beginning my speech. Oh, please also like give my POIs after the 5th minute. Right, so I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Chair, the essential nucleus of the Korean being, North or South, over anything values family, values identity, community, history, and heritage. We think the South Korean government values these particular sentiments, and we think opposition values it 100 times more, such that we value the pursuit of even trying to get this rather than even the guaranteed result, because we think the pursuit of achieving it is something that is very important. Right. Moving on, before we move on to our clashes, a few rebuttals that we have. The first one is on the implications of government politics on North Korea to statehood, right? The first one is on how authoritarianism is stigmatized and creates like then stigma for these people. We're going to give you a few responses. The first response is that we think there are many scenarios that exist where we hate oppressive systems and not necessarily the people that are oppressed. We think this exists in scenarios like the Holocaust. We don't think we have particular hate for Jews, but we've got particular hate for those very oppressive systems in themselves. So we think this is something that is very important for us to notice. But secondly, we think this is something that never really necessarily translates to hate for the oppressed. But secondly, we think that even in fact, we think that this actually creates empathy and more interest in saving these oppressed groups. We think people are more happy to support the North Koreans that made it across the borders. This is why there's so many survival stories that are pushed to mainstream media about these particular things. We think because that's how it's become profitable, a profitable narrative for politicians, etc. So we think the idea of actually North Koreans surviving these oppressive systems and making it to the South Korean border, why that's such a profitable and such a valuable narrative for politicians and everyone all around is particularly because they care about the safety and the health of these North Koreans. We don't think that's like a fair premise to set, right? Then secondly, we think that the idea that proposition holds of them then proceeding to even help these North Koreans through different forms when they firstly admit that they hate, or that the people hate North Koreans and they hate their taxes being wasted, but then go on in the same breath to talk about how these taxes should be spent on buying housing, on trying to like help these North Koreans and, you know, military intervention and whatnot, is in itself a contradiction, because you can't go in the same sentence and talk about how much they hate North Korea and wasting their money on North Korea at the same time, and then like show how South Korean governments will use their money to try and save these people. But secondly, we think they talk about how then there's an imbalance in the voting demographic the moment that North Koreans are like really put. First of all, the first response to this is, one, we don't think that this debate is even taking grounds on the place that this is something that's going to be highly guaranteed. We don't think that's the case for opposition. We've already shown you that this case is more particularly about the pursuit of this reunification and what that particularly does for us. But even if it wasn't, supposedly, we think that the revaluation or the reunification of like these two is particularly so important for saving these North Korean people, which is a great narrative for the politicians to have within the first place. We think the overarching problems that are going to exist, such as poverty, are things that are probably going to exist with the next government, because governments only then change, like governments then change power and like Koreans, because at the end of the day, South Korean government, because at the end of the day, it means they get all the praise for accepting the North Koreans, and the following government that perhaps maybe is an opposing government may probably get all the hate for instability. But anyway, moving on, what do we think the main clashes in today's debate were? We think, first of all, it's who then best serves the interests of the actor, one, but two, the relationships between Koreans, North and South, and three, the implications of recognition of statehood, right? So we'll start with the relationships that exist between North Koreans and North and South, right? So first thing that prop tells us is that they're diverged in terms of culture, and this is something that's inherently bad, right? So first of all, we think that number one, we think that, first of all, we've already shown you that even if they are diverged in terms of culture, assuming that is, we think that like there's a popular narrative of pity that already exists within these people. We think they don't necessarily hate North Koreans. We think they pity them. They're sad about the situation that they're within, and they'll do anything to try and get them out. We think anyone who plays to that narrative is a popular narrative. That's why that popular narrative is pushed across mainstream media. But secondly, even so, assuming that this wasn't true, we've already shown you how their family values that exist, like in general Korean people, right? To say that even if that wasn't true as well, we think the benefits of Asians in and of themselves, or the benefits to Asia of having a reunified Korea, is something that benefits them, because you don't have situations, or like you don't have like situations of a potential threat hanging on your head of like being eventually invaded by North Korea. We think that's something that's particularly valuable for the South Korean government, and it looks like something that would be plausible for them. But anyway, let's move on to who then best solves the interest of the actor, right? So they tell us on their side that, well, this is not necessarily going to serve the interest of the actor, because one, perhaps you've got situations whereby like there'll be like too much money that's going to be wasted on them, right? We give you a response to that as opposition. We tell you about how those costs, in the same breath, they talk about like how in the same breath they talk about how wasting costs is going to be then costly, but at the same time they give another costly alternative of trying to then like donate to these people, right? We think this already just downplays as a contradiction on like the argument that they're making. But secondly, they tell us about how these people are perhaps maybe going to destroy like the economy in itself. But we tell you that even if that was like that's particularly not the case, because we tell you that, first of all, we've already shown you like those particular things, right? But then let's move on to an extra argument, right? We think, which is the implications on government politics of North Korean statehood. I'm going to give you 3 premises for this. The first premise is how politicians, particularly in liberal democracies, are big in attempting to please, one, the international community and their allies, because this provides for them their economic trade and stability that they want and all the sorts, but 2, the voter demographic, so that they can re-vote them in. Second premise is that the recognition of statehood to a far-right fascist dictator is a very morally abhorrent thing to the majority of people, because we think people, no matter conservative or liberal, have come to a specific point where they can generally just agree on the fact that fascism is a terrible thing in itself. And we think all of them are willing to find it as something that's morally abhorrent to accept and to legitimize, right? But thirdly, we think the recognition of statehood recognizes 3 things. Not only 2 things, not only the sovereignty of that state, but it then recognizes those authorities as legitimate authorities of dictatorship. So we think this then translates to complicity with the existing dictatorship systems that are already there. What are the impacts of this? 3 things. One, the impact is that it's perceived as an endorsing slavery, which means that there are no chances of these people particularly getting re-voted. But secondly, it means that due to the obligation that they have to those particular Korean people, politicians, that means, and because politicians are people in general, it means that you've massively failed themselves, they've massively failed the culture, North Koreans and South Koreans as a whole, right? But then thirdly, we think the international community would find this as something that is very abhorrent. One, because we think economic sanctions are probably something that they would slap these people with for particularly not adhering to the same vision that the international community has and their allies have. This will end up leading to worsening trade for these people and automatically lead to a worse off socioeconomic status for these people. But secondly, we think it leads to bad media publicity, which is something that is very unfavorable for politicians in themselves, right? And then the last contention that we had within today's debate was the implications of the recognition of statehood, right? We show you how the implications of the recognition of statehood looks like complicity with these systems, and is particularly that is something that is terrible for these particular states, right? And we don't necessarily think we receive much engagement on this. With this, never have I ever been more proud to oppose.
All right, I thank that speaker. I invite Kavweb.
Hi, can I confirm that both audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, thank you so much. Excuse. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. I think side opposition believes that most countries should not even exist and it should not be legitimized as a country because they simply do not want to support slavery. I think the justification of if you recognize a country as independent, it means you're going to supporting all their actions. We see it's simply not true. So very proud to propose. So my speech, I'm going to firstly deal with the principal claim about how they should go against their principal obligation to these people before moving on to 2 questions about firstly, is this reunification actually even possible? And secondly, how exactly does it manifest and what are the outcomes of it? But firstly, for the principle, what exactly do they tell us? They tell us that, you hold a principal obligation to your citizens, so therefore you should not abandon them. And you abandon them when you actually just say, these people are going to be part of another state. Is that firstly, just note this is an active motion. So we see the principal obligation they want to argue towards. They actually have to be able to tie it back to why does South Korea actually care? I feel like the government will not actually care about, maybe I have a principal obligation to do so because it actually does not manifest into any actions they should take. It probably does not bring any tangible benefit to the state in general. However, the second response is that we see in North Korea literally just recently changed their constitution. They literally said they're not going to support this unification. They literally So I feel like when these citizens no longer perceive you as a government, you probably no longer hold an obligation to these groups of people. Also, thirdly, is that I feel like if you're going to argue you have an obligation towards your citizens, I think it's just going to be more support on our side of the house. Because I see you actually have a direct obligation of actually trying to help out the other citizens within the nation. You're not going to ruin an entire nation just to help out potentially other people who are perceived to be on a different border. First question then, is reunification actually even possible? What does the opposition tell us? They tell us that, so these people have similar values and they don't. So that's why like people actually do not have these tensions. So they'll just immediately welcome this reunification. Is that firstly, is that North Korea? Is that even if you believe people want to have this reunification, the fact that the government simply does not want this to happen means it probably just simply won't happen. I don't think they're able to overcome like Kim Jong-un by sheer force on their side house. However, secondly, is that we still see that people actually do not have the like this peaceful mindset in mind. Why exactly is the case? Okay, let's just take the example of people hate the government. I feel like if you hate the government, you probably have some degree of association to these groups of people. Because for example, if you have like groups where you have the entire population of North Korea coming in, when you have a reunification, it looks like people are going to think it's really bad. So it looks like they say, oh, these people coming in equals North Korea equals bad. I think that's what goes through the mindset. So therefore, actually do not want to allow this. So therefore, what it looks like is you're probably just have a pushback against this. I already give you structural reasons down the bench as to why they have like these people do not support. We give you 5 structural reasons down the bench, and we see it looks like if you're brought under a different government, you should probably internalize like what this government is teaching you. So therefore, we see actually do not have similar values. They do not have the shared culture. Okay, let me just deal with their point about these stories of like people actually escaping and therefore like how it's actually sensationalized and the politicians actually really like this in general. I think firstly, it's just to recognize that these stories of actually people escaping from North Korea, it's like just have the fact of having these stories and just the fact that it covers on media, probably means that there's not a lot of people actually escaping from North Korea. I think the difference here is that right now you're actually forcing South Korea and you're taking away the taxpayers' money to help out the entire population of North Korea. They probably would care if it's only very few individuals maybe potentially escaping. However, right now, if you're directly taking money away from the current like citizens of South Korea to like actually sustain another entire country, to sustain another entire population, I think that's the thing I actually do not want. They try to argue that, oh, simply having pity is enough. However, we see that, for example, if you're just comparing pity for like a person you actually do not know and it's coming from another border and which like we probably do not really like at all, versus, for example, getting a better education for your kid. I think you probably want to help out you getting your better education for your kid. Taking side opposition's analysis of saying, oh, they actually want to help out society, want to help out family, they want to fulfill these Confucianist like values. I think you probably are more able to do on our side how to actually help out your kid get education versus probably just like helping somebody out in which you actually don't have a like proximity, like you don't connect yourself to that individual. What exactly do we tell you then? We give you 5 structural reasons down the bench as to why this reunification is not going to be possible because you're going to such great backlash from the people and therefore actually don't push for it. We told you there's social stigma. We told you there's minimal desire compared to what you could advocate for like otherwise. We told you you're still not strong enough militarily because when you actually have military campaigns to fight back and also say, oh, you want to reunify South Korea with North Korea, it's simply not going to happen. We told you it's extremely costly, and we told you that there's actively less support day and day because you see that it's actually not going to happen, and we see you're already losing support right now. Why exactly is this so important then? We see that the backlash from the people basically prevents reunification happening in the first place, and we want to use this, and instead what we do on our side house is you're probably using the money you're trying to funnel into having reunification processes occur. Problem looks like we're going to help out South Korea, we're helping out the problems, domestic problems that currently exist within the country. I feel it also clarifies their case a lot. But I feel away from South Korean society. So, and moving on to my second question then, about how exactly it will manifest and what are the outcomes of it. And before I move on, are there any points? Okay, seeing none, I'll move on. What exactly does side opposition tell us? Is that they tell us that you lose support from the West because you legitimize North Korea's dictatorship and everything they do. So therefore, the West will cut economic ties. I feel like we've already pushed down the bench that firstly, recognizing sovereignty does not equal they really legitimize their actions. It looks like on their side house, they're like, I think just look at our current society. You still recognize. You still recognize within our status quo. However, secondly, is that I'm not sure where this logic actually lies as to why you actually have this degree of support. However, if you're believing you're legitimizing your actions because, for example, they opt in international organizations or something, I feel like you already acted accountability mechanism. Megan already brought that up. It still has not been responded to. And then thirdly, is that even if you believe my previous responses do not make sense, why exactly will the West still not cut ties? So we told you that the North has already, like, the North already does not really support the reunification processes. And we see that it's already given in the info slide as well. And we see what exactly this means is that when the North is rejecting this, everybody actually knows about this. So therefore, if you basically back off the reunification process, because like you fear North Korea actually attacking if you actually don't really support this, if you're kind of acting as self-defense, I feel international community probably still understand reunification is still not possible, especially in the recent times, especially with the nuke powers that North Korea has. What exactly do we tell you on side proposition then? We already told you there are existing tensions that will happen if you put these groups of people who hate each other within this within same community. We told you there's still gonna be there's gonna be a lot of tensions. We told you it's going to harm the economy, and we told you that the war that actually does happen for it to actually have a reunification process in the first place is still extremely costly to rebuild. Why exactly is it so important then? We already gave the best case under the best case scenario of reunification actually working. I think we still win the debate, because what happens at the end of the day is you get a fragmented society, you get ones that are already torn down, you get one that economy is not any viable, and we see you get a society in which you have millions of people suffering under direct harms simply because you want to bring fragmented societies together. So very proud to propose.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. I invite Opwip.
Okay, I'd just like to confirm that I'm audible.
Yes.
Okay, just a second to sort out my notes. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Proposition tells you that the citizens of these countries recognize each other as enemies. We don't concede to this. We think that we tell you a story of families, of kin, torn apart by war, separated by a line that cuts across the land, dividing brother from brother, father from daughter, separated by a regime that rules with an iron fist, oppressing its own people. In response to proposition resides a quest for longing and hope, a quest for human rights and dignity and freedom rights. So a few things I'm going to do in this speech are our arguments do a bit of weighing and outline the inconsistencies in proposition's case. What do we think that this debate essentially was about? We think that within this debate, we had two options, right? Where we either pursue reunification or recognize statehood, right? We think that it's not enough to show why the pursuit needed to prove why recognizing statehood is something that was desirable. So they pose a question to us, right? Is this reunification possible, right? We think that this debate was not centered around this reunification, but it was centered around the pursuit of this reunification, right? We characterize this as something that was gradual, right? And a good example of this is what happened in Germany, right? Where we had a country separated in half with communist and democratic views, right? But in the end, they still did end up gradually becoming reunified, right? We think that this is something that can happen over time, right? So we think we won't wake up in the quest for reunification is something that we'll just have at the palm of our fingertips, right? And we think that it's very important to note that as an actor within the context of this debate, we've already shown you that this quest for reunification is something that South Korea would value because it's democratic ideals, right? We told you that they'll still pursue reunification even with statehood because those dictators in North Korea have an incentive to eliminate the growth of liberal ideology. Either way, they'll still pursue this reunification, right? So a few things on refutation, right? They tell you that reunification is unlikely due to the social stigma and how North Koreans and South Koreans apparently detest each other, right? We think that the premise of this argument is false. We've already characterized to you a world in which these people have a shared culture, right? We already tell you that the line of the 38th parallel is arbitrary, right? We think that it's a rhetoric that demonizes the Kim regime. We don't think that these people within these countries inherently hate each other. We think that what they do hate is the oppressor. They do not hate the oppressed, right? We already characterized to you a world in which there won't be any social stigma because the feeling that these South Korean citizens have is a feeling of empathy, right? And this is something that inherently puts an obligation on the government of South Korea to ensure that they do actually pursue reunification rights. They tell you how there'll be conflicts between North Korea and South Korea because of the pre-existing stigma, but we already think we've already taken this clash within the debate today, right? Because we tell you how already South Koreans as a whole do want this reunification, right? Now, moving on, right? We also characterize to you what South Korea stands for, right, as an actor, right? We tell you that it values Confucianist ideals, right? Meaning that it values family and unity because of that, right? We think that they wouldn't want to,
Point of
proposition comes with the idea of how they wouldn't want to help North Korea because it's a waste of money, right? But inherently, we already take this clash because we show you how the cross-border policy by South Korea as an actor has already shown how North Koreans are deemed as citizens of this country. They're deemed as people who are valued because of the shared culture, the shared language that they already have, right? Which already proves that the premise of Proposition's argument was false. Now, on to rebuilding our case, right? And the inconsistencies in Proposition's case. We think that side Proposition failed to realize what this debate truly was about, right? They say that South Korea hates North Korea, but in the same way, it says that we should take taxes at South Korea and instead we should use these to try and save North Korea. We don't think this is something that side Proposition can argue for within the same breath, right? What did we do for you within this debate, right? We showed you how recognizing North Korea as an independent state would do three things inherently. It would endorse their sovereignty, it would legitimize their government, and it would legitimize its government's actions. We think that South Korea inherently as an actor wouldn't want to do any of these three things because it's governed by democratic ideals and it values its relationships that it has with the international community. We tell you that at a point in time where South Korea does this as an actor, this will have detrimental ripple effects on South Korea as a country because we think that it would incentivize other countries to put sanctions on this country, which will inherently lead to socio-economic issues within the country. And this is something that we don't think the actor of this debate would value, right? We think that a pursuit looks like harboring we think that a pursuit looks like harboring refugees that expose North Korea, enacting change in the country, right? We think that even though Kim Jong-un has nuclear powers, mutual assured discretion is something that still exists within the status quo, right? So with that, we still feel as though we have taken that clash, right? In addition to this, let's do some weighing, right? On which side of the house actually showed the interests of South Korea, right? Side Proposition comes with the idea that these countries have diverged, right, in the past 80 years, and they recognize each other's enemies. We think that we've already done a fair job at showing you how this entirely is not false. We show you a world in which these people are willingly put and accepted into South Korea when they come as refugees. We show you how there's already policies put into place that view them as actual citizens of North Korea. We show you how these people inherently have a shared identity, have a shared culture, have a shared language, and therefore we think inherently we've already shown that these countries, we fulfill the interest of South Korea, which is to ensure that they do apply their democratic views, right? And we think that confusion, they tell you that confusion is about following orders. Inherently, we think that confusion is about family. We think that confusion within South Korea is about upholding democratic ideals, and that this is something that they value, that inherently they wouldn't want to know that their king, their family, those with super close ties to them are suffering. This is something that they wouldn't value as an actor, and we think we've done a good job at portraying this, right? They also tell you that North and South Korea's relationship is bad, right? But we tell you that even if there's a popular narrative, right, of this, right? We tell you that instead there's a popular narrative of pity, right? We tell you that they don't hate the oppressed, they instead hate the oppressor. And we show you how media inherently in South Korea already portrays this, right? And we already show you how confusion ideology already portrays this, right? They also pose the question, right? Why would South Korea care inherently about North Korea, right? We think that we've already done a fair job at showing this. We tell you about the confusion ideology. We tell you about how this country is democratic in nature. We tell you that because it's an actor that upholds democracy as a form of government, it's something that inherently it wants to apply in its day-to-day runnings, right? We tell you that it wouldn't want to opt out of its democratic views and then go against what its democratic views stand for as a whole, right? So with that, we definitely feel as though we have taken this clash. We think that this debate should be given to the side of the House that best shows the interest of the stakeholder, of the actor of this debate. Panel, we paint to you a clear world where we win this debate. Proud to oppose.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. I invite opposition reply.
All right. So just give me a moment to set my timer. And then I'll begin. All right. Okay, I'll be beginning my speech in 3, 2, 1. Here, 2 points of clarity. We think if proposition wanted to win this debate, what they had to do is to prove not only why the pursuit is bad, but why the seeking of statehood or granting of statehood is completely something that is good. We think what they had to do is comparatively show us why then granting statehood is far likely a better idea than then seeking the pursuit of this. But secondly, we think on the idea of statehood, we told you, or both sides came to the idea of how like statehood is about legitimizing the existing governments, right? And that narrative, whether you like it or not, is something that is spread throughout the IR, through the international relations, and so on and so forth. We don't think we receive much engagement on that. But anyway, we think we're going to divide this into 3 contentions: why the pursuit is important, and the impact of it when you do succeed, and then who then best serves the interests of the actor and the relationships between the Koreans, North and South, right? So the first one on why then the pursuit is particularly important. What does OP tell you? OP tells you that, one, we think you've got an obligation to these people by virtue of coming from the same family. We think we get some intuition pumps that come from the first speaker. But then overall, we think the effects that this pursuit has on the international relations, we think we show you on how like there's going to be general vetoes from international relations, but even the people of North Korea and their suffering in general, and how like you legitimize their suffering from, yeah, but then thirdly, we also show you the relationship that exists with like just general Asian politics and the precedents that you set for then these dictatorships then continuously growing their empire, kind of legitimizing the politicians and the dictatorships that exist within those particular scenarios. We don't necessarily get much of a reason from opposition why then that pursuit is not particularly unimportant. So we think that clash in itself then went to opposition. But then the second one on why then the impact if you do succeed, right? So what Prop tells you is that in the instance that we do grant statehood, we think at the same time we legitimize the suffering of like these particular groups, but it needs to be able to send help, and like the politicians in themselves will not necessarily be like burdened to take care of these Koreans. We think we get responses from this. We think the idea, first of all, that the likelihood of this actually you get responses to say that, well, the idea of you actually legitimizing these forms of slavery does not sit well with like the opposition, and this is something that particularly won't be great in terms of international relations. But we think at a point in time at which you've managed to annex like a North Korean government, and you've succeeded in bringing North Koreans into a democratic system where they can at least have like a say and rights, we think this is particularly something that is an important impact that perhaps will like bring an important impact that is valuable on our side, right? But then again, we move on to then who then best serves the interests of the actor. So what do these guys tell us? One, they talk about the image on how like the socioeconomic struggle that they're going to receive, like with the moment that they obtain these people, which will make these actors like disincentivized because of the image. But secondly, they tell you this is costly. We give you like about 3 responses to this. First of all, we talk about the pity narrative. We talk about how mainstream media generally loves like these people, and we think even if at the end of the day, we think the idea of trying to save them from these like terrible dictatorships is something that is particularly valuable. But secondly, we show you that costs at the end of the day still like exist on both sides, one, but secondly, that it's a contradiction to say in the same breath that like you would like have a lot of cost existing, and this is something that is particularly bad, and then pledge sending a lot of resources to through taxpayers' money to like save these particular individuals, right? But then what do we also tell you on Prop? We tell you on Prop that like there's the international community, and like these people veto this thing and slap you with sanctions. We also tell you that people generally who view you as people who are complicit with suffering and therefore have a likely chance of not revoting you again. But lastly, we talk about the relationships between North Koreans and South Koreans. We think they tell us that they're diverged in forms of culture, and we give you some responses to this. One, we give you the pity narrative in the instance that this is not true. But secondly, we give you about the family values that also exist. And we also talk to you lastly about the family values that exist in the worst possible instance of like reunification. Right. With this, never have I ever been more proud to oppose.
All right, thank that speaker. I invite proposition reply.
I'm just checking that I'm visible and audible again.
Yeah.
Cool. Side opposition's case was rather contradicting. The path to victory is very simple under our side of the house. 3 things I'll prove. First, is stigma existent between North and South Koreans? Secondly, why reunification doesn't yield you any results? And thirdly, why reunification is actively creating harm during the process of pursuit. But before that, 2 key observations from their speech. Firstly, they concede that reunification is pretty much impossible under their side, coming from LO, saying, oh, this is not what the debate is about. Secondly, they didn't engage with a large amount of taxpayer money that you have to then invest in things like military campaigns or diplomacy. This is an active economic harm they completely ignored in this debate. But moving on to 3 key clarifications. Firstly, what is their stance? Their stance is, oh, they would try to pursue unification, but it is not their burden to defend why unification would happen. But notice, they argue it is the obligation of a government to reunite family lines that were once connected. Then they have to mechanize as to why unification would succeed. If family lines were separated in the first place, and they can't prove to you why unification between these families would happen, it is unclear to me as to what sort of impact you get. But second piece of clarification, with no mechanism, side opposition claimed which is absolutely nonsense. But thirdly, they strawmanned our argument saying that, oh, we never said we will use taxpayers' money on North Korea. Notice, we said that we would no longer have to otherwise pay taxpayer money on funding the pursuit of North Korea and South Korea reunification if we took our side. That's exactly our argument. They never engaged with this. But now moving on to the first clash. Is stigma existent between North Koreans and South Koreans? What has opposition told you? They told you 3 things. First, there's a shared culture. Second, there's a shared principle, family lines. And third, people do not dislike North Koreans. They just dislike the authoritarian state of this. But notice, we told you on proposition side throughout the first 24 minutes of their speech that went unengaged. Firstly, I wanted to ask a POI. They never actually accepted it. The POI is going to be this. Descendants are unlikely to care about their ancestors that diverged 80 years ago. I don't even know who my ancestors are 80 years ago. I'm unlikely to care about the family lines that they so value under their side. Secondly, look at the status quo. There are North Korean defectors who escaped from North Korea to South Korea. Look at how much stigma and hate they're receiving from South Koreans just because there are outsiders and just because there are people that are not recognized as part of South Korea. Thirdly, they argue that there's a shared culture, but we just don't think this is the case. One is very authoritarian and the other is very democratic. We don't think this is the case. Fourthly, we probably argue that the number of people who care about the family lines are very minimal because after diverging for 80 years, the majority of the family lines you have, 99.99% of the family lines you have are probably the ones that are already diverged already. You already recognize your own family lines. We don't think this is an important issue in this debate. But notice, the implication of this clash is very simple. It takes down their entire principal obligation as to why the pursuit of reunification for family purposes is simply important. They don't argue, they don't prove why it's important. But let's judge. Let's assume that maintaining the reunification is important. What have they told you? They told you that it is pragmatically impossible to reunite. Notice, if you can't reunite, then you can't actively claim the impact of reunification of family lines. The implication of this clash also concedes to the fact that there will be discrimination against North Koreans once you reunify, which their only response is, oh, there will be no discrimination, which we don't even get under their side of the house. But not onto the second clash as to why reunifying would actively not look bad. They say that, oh, you granting statehood is very bad. But notice, it's an actor motion. We don't really care about North Korea's legitimizing their control if we are South Korea as the house. But secondly, they argue that it will look back to allies on the international stage. But notice, there's no tangible impact. You just said you look back. But secondly, the only impact they said from DOO was, oh, there were going to be economic sanctions. But we tell you that allies already understand that it's impossible to reunify. Allies were probably not going to put up these sanctions in the first place. But secondly, they never responded to the economic impacts that would happen as a result of you having to fund 30 years of pursuit, which means this is active harm that you have to deal with. We engage with all of your points and we win this debate. Vote proposition.
All right, thank that speaker for the speech. Thank all debaters for an excellent round. Cross the floor, shake hands. You guys can exit the room, and all the best. Meanwhile, judges, you can join or prep room 5 for the telep. Yeah, room 5 op.